money?
I thought that was an interesting, very interesting response. More troops, more money. You've heard it here first. You have not heard it from the administration, who is not willing ever to say that, and who should have said it a year and a half ago. A point about the government of national unity. You cannot have a government of national unity unless you are willing to compromise a little bit on what you are trying to do. People do not come into the government unless you're willing to accept their views. Otherwise, it's simply decoration. And this is the problem the Bush administration has had throughout. The reason that other countries haven't come in, you know, you have to be under American command. You will get none of the goodies of Reconstruction. They have done it, as in all things, in a completely uncompromising way. And David's answer implies that there has to be some kind of compromise, which implies that the Bush administration would have to change the way it does business. And I don't know that it can do that.
If you have questions, there's a microphone about halfway back, so please line up. Keep it brief and make sure it's a question. Yes, sir.
I have a two-part question. The first is to Ken and David. Why was the historical record of the British so overlooked in this run-up to the war, albeit slow on your part? I mean, what happened in 1920 was enormous. The British were chased out of there, in effect. Why did we overlook that? Did we think that we were going to be better? Number two, David, you're an irreplaceable man. You're indispensable president. We keep talking more and more every day about the incompetence. Is he so irreplaceable? Is he so competent? Not to me. I'd like your answers on both.
Let me answer the 1920 question first, because I think actually it opens up some interest. The people, at least I talked to, did think about 1920 a lot, and it had to do, and what they were impressed by was that many people in the Shiite community in Iraq, 1920 was a lesson for them as well. 1920 was a Shiite insurrection against British rule. The way the British dealt with that, yes, the British withdrew from the country, but first they suppressed the insurrection. They created a Sunni-dominated Iraqi army, which then did the fighting for, a lot of the fighting for them, and did it in very brutal ways, and they left behind a Sunni ruling structure, 20% of the country, that lasted until April of 2003. I think many people in Shiite Iraq, 1920 was a disaster for them. Yeah, they got the British out, but they didn't get what they wanted. They got something even worse. And one of the reasons why people like Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami thought that Iraq was a place that was ready for change was that you had this majority community that had been through this traumatic experience and was ready for something new. And there may be some moments after April of 2003 when that was feasible. As for George Bush, I didn't call him indispensable. I didn't call him irreplaceable. I said he was the right man, not for all seasons, but for a particular season. Because there is one thing that, and this is still true, and this is why I support him to this day, that he understood the scale of the problem. That he was the one person who understood he agreed. I guess I agreed with him about how big an event 9/11 was and how much it demanded from the country, and it was not an opportunity. It was not something to do and then get past and then go back to the way things were before.
Yes.
We've spoken mostly about Iraq, or you have, for obvious reasons, but if President Bush wins re-election and the neoconservative faction of his administration, stays in power, what sort of direction would that group of people urge towards other foreign policy crises? I'm thinking of Iran in particular, although North Korea as well.
Who's the question for? Anyone?
Really for anyone, but I guess for Mr. Adams and Mr. Frum in particular.
Sure, I'll be happy to. First of all, this is another thing that drove me up the wall last night. Let's not forget that George Bush is president. Dick Cheney is vice president. The Secretary of Defense is Don Rumsfeld. These are not people who have been, thought of as neocons in the way. And the idea that there's, again, this conspiratorial idea is, I think, very aggravating to me in that way. All right, point made. Number two, on North Korea, I'll take. It is very interesting what's happening on North Korea, and it came up in the debates 2 nights ago. Here is John Kerry, one of his big complaints about Bush foreign policy. It's unilateral. And Catherine said we went unilaterally, forgetting that the British were there and some others into Iraq, but everything is unilateral. Here is a president who said, hey, North Korea is not a unilateral problem. It is a problem that involves the South Koreans, for sure, the Chinese, for real sure, for the Russians, for sure, the Japanese, for real sure, as well as us. So let's internationalize it. Let's have them get a stake in this negotiations, so it's not to blame everything on the United States. Let's internationalize it. And John Kerry, you know, last night, the night before last, is criticizing Bush for multilateralizing it. I think it's a very good approach, because once North Korea goes nuclear in a more overt way, God forbid, but if that happens, those countries have more at stakes in this situation than we do. I think that's very responsibly handled. I think Iran is responsible handling.
Your question more bluntly. Can we expect another preemptive war in a second Bush administration?
I never expected any preemptive war in the Bush administration until 9/11 came along. And I did not believe that Iraq could have been possible without 9/11. I'll tell you what 9/11 did, and this is something that, if you forget about anything else you hear today, from me, just get this in your mind, that we know two things since 9/11 that some of us didn't know before, at least to the extent. Number one is there is an international network out there of people who are organized and out to get Western civilization and civilization in general, and I don't just mean America, but we're prime target number one. I'm talking about attacks in Madrid, Bali, elsewhere around the world, total destruction. And number two is the advent of weapons of mass destruction. Make this that war has been, in a sense, privatized. It took Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Saddam Hussein's, the tyrants of the last 100 years. It took them the ability to get into power in their states in order to wreak enormous damage with millions of people. Now that ability has been diffused in a way that those without state power can do that because of weapons of mass destruction. And those two realities changed the whole shape of our security.
Next question.
Okay, I want to return to the question of the emergence of neocon thinking after 9/11. Everybody talk about the lesson of 9/11. 9/11, and that's the question for you, 9/11 was committed by people who are from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, two countries that we are strongly holding their governments, strongly are pro-American, and you know, so it didn't come from Libya, from Iraq, from Iran, from this kind of country. So the real lesson of 9/11 is that when you hold governments that are hated by a certain group of people, you can get hit.
What's the question?
Okay, so I want to understand how, by making Iraq another Saudi Arabia and Libya, you think that this is really learning from the lessons of 9/11. I'm just wondering how neocon thinking, which should be hurt by 9/11, should be hurt. That you go and hold governments. That's the lesson of going and holding governments. And another quick question is about evangelicals and Jews. Excuse me for framing it like this. You say neocons are Jews. There's also an evangelical trend in this administration. And if the kind of more Jewish neocon element wanted to, and I'm not unsympathetic to the idealism, wanted to change the Middle East, it's very bad that Tom DeLay goes to the Israeli Knesset, I'm Israeli, and says, I don't see a Palestinian problem, I don't see a Palestinian state. I mean, one of the things that a lot of people in Israel thought, and rightly, was that part of not declaring war against Islam in the Middle East and trying to actually look a little different is solving the Palestinian problem.
Okay,
this administration
one question,
okay, sorry.
two statements, and we need an answer from anyone who wants to take a crack at it. Mark.
I don't think it was directed to me, but I'll
Thank you for not being shy.
I'll try to answer. I agree with what you said about Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It's one of the great mysteries of a policy designed to spread democracy in the Middle East, why it begins with a country that's absolutely hostile to the United States and impervious to its influence, when in fact the United States is funding the government of Egypt to the tune of $3 billion a year. That regime, which is autocratic, would not survive without American support. It's unlikely the Saudi regime would survive without American support. So it seems deeply irrational, particularly to the people in the Middle East, not only deeply irrational, but hypocritical and kind of laughable, that the United States would begin what is a democracy project by invading and occupying Iraq. So I agree with you completely on that. I mean, to take issue with the 9/11 and the whole...
lesson of 9/11? Why is that?
Well, let me just say something about what Ken just said about the lesson of 9/11 and what we've heard several times here today. You know, I think 9/11 did change things. It was an attack on the United States, but I also think there's a kind of sacralization of it as changing the entire world that's wrong, and that the rest of the world is not very sympathetic to as well. You know, the notion that, well, now we know there are these people, you know, dedicated to destroying civilization. They're not dedicated to destroying civilization. They're dedicated to overthrowing regimes in the Middle East and ending American influence there. They have a very direct, specific political project. It also didn't, you know, taught us about weapons of mass destruction. No, it didn't. They used airliners. They did not use weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction are very dangerous. We've heard about this before, but they were essentially used as the tool to link 9/11 to Iraq. And the cause of Iraq pre-existed 9/11. This was not about 9/11. It was the fact that 9/11 allowed a window of opportunity for people who cherished the goal of overthrowing Saddam Hussein and who had done so for many, many years to take that opportunity and do it. Okay. And it has been, for this project, a disaster.
More questions. Yes, sir.
This is for Mr. Frum and for Mr. Edelman. Which is the more important value, democracy or self-determination? And if the result of the next 4 years is something other than democracy in Iraq, do we go in and keep overthrowing the government until the Iraqis get it right?
The first half of the question, it's a strange question, democracy or democracy is self-determination. That to say, what I think we do tend to do, and this is sort of the Kofi Annan view of the world, is we say that determination, that we are going to respect determination by whichever group of people happen to have the guns and the power at any moment. Now, you can't, I'm not offering this as a guide to foreign policy, because there are many practicalities and expedients, but in my, if you ask me in my innermost thought, not what I'd advise, but when I see many of these people claim to be exercising the right of self-determination, to me, they're kidnappers. They've got guns, and they've taken a bunch of people, 1 million, 10 million, 30 million people, and they've kidnapped them. And I think, you know, again, there are a lot of practicalities, but as to the moral claim, their moral claim to rule, I do not concede it. Now, is the United States going to invade and re-invade Iraq again? The promises, there could be something where through some genuine project of choice that the Iraqi people would say, you know, we want again to turn over our lives and property and safety to some people with guns. I don't think people do that, not in this day and age.
Yes.
To follow up on that same democracy question, it seems very intriguing that you want to spread democracy in the Middle East. We have to overthrow these governments that have been supported by status quoers in the State Department and have real elections. But it's the same argument that fundamentalist Islamists in these countries have been making for decades. So my question is, it seems that you know, you're talking about democracy and that these democracies in the Middle East are going to be pro-American. It seems to me that that's an absurd notion. My idea, I mean, as somebody who is from the Middle East, is that any democratic change will be less pro-American, more Islamist, more fundamentalist. So my question is, what if that happens? And Mr. Frum, you said something about Jordan not, you know, we thought Jordan was an ally, but it's not an ally now. And I'm thinking, Jordan is a monarchy that suppresses its, you know, descendants and Islamists and is made peace with Israel, is very supportive of the United States. Anything else would be an Islamist, you know, government that's not friendly. So what more do you want from Jordan, or from any other country for that matter? I mean, what more can any other form of government give the United States that these countries aren't?
Okay. The question is more democracy, more Islamism in the Middle East, and Jordan is sort of the example of that.
But you know, it's a very profound question, and it's one that you know is, I think, raises the same challenges you hear in that, you know, old joke about the man giving advice in the country. I wouldn't start from here. I mean, the United States, the Middle East was a relatively low strategic priority of the United States for 40 years after World War II. And as a result of that, it was a situation very like what happened in Latin America for 30 years after World War II. It was a low strategic priority, and so you put up with a lot. You put up with a lot of second and third bests in order to achieve certain ends. And I'm not even saying that those were not necessarily even irrational or even bad decisions, but that's what happened. And the result is